Hey, welcome back! This week I have a rather short video for you because actually this weekend is my birthday weekend. So we're gonna make a rather short video so I have some time to party. But if it's even possible, I like not to skip a week making videos because the algorithm is really annoying. So today we're gonna focus on a rather small topic. And that topic this time again is CSS related, because there's so many amazing CSS things happening nowadays, and one of these new things is the ability to animate gradients. I mean, people have asked for that for so long, and now we can animate gradients. So let's dive into that right away. So in order to show you how to animate gradients, of course we need an example. And that example today I found on the Dribbble website, and what we're gonna rebuild is actually this. You also see these moving blobs in the background, which we're gonna add as well, but they're always the same color. But what you see is that when you move the slider, that the color of the gradient transitions from one color to the other color. And that's something that until recently was not possible with plain CSS. However, right now it is. There were some other alternatives around there, like moving the background position of a gradient, or using SVG, for example, to make an animated gradient. But doing it with plain CSS and doing it with all of these dynamic colors was not something that was possible. So today I'm going to show you that it actually is possible. It's unfortunately not yet supported in Firefox, but that's the only browser that it doesn't work in. So I think it's still worth teaching, because the fallback is that the gradient doesn't animate, and that would even be an okay experience in Firefox perhaps. So definitely worth checking out how this works. So in order to make this video not too long, I already prepared a little bit of HTML for this. What you see here is the title, and there's a slider with a text above it. And if you move it, the text will update to could be better, okay, or happy. And you also notice that the knob is already changing colors, and that is because there is already some dynamic colors involved. There only is no background gradient yet. So let's take a brief look at the HTML that's already there, so we know how things are working and we can pick it up from there. So what you see here is we're using a range input slider, and that is actually styled with some custom CSS. And the stylings for this you can find in the index.css, because we needed to write a little bit of custom styling for it. But that range slider, whenever you change the slider, it will set a specific number between 1 and 3, and that will be stored in the state. And that state, so it will be a number either 1, 2, or 3. And in our case, we're using a little bit of TypeScript to map that to sad, neutral, or happy. So this number is then what we're using to, for example, get specific colors and also get the title. Because TypeScript would inject, for example, a 1 here. So this is an object that has a property of 1 and then has a specific title. So if we look a little bit down, you can see that we use this map and insert the feeling in there, which is coming from this state. So that means that we're actually, if the state is 1, we would pick property 1, which is sad, from the object, which gives us the title could be better. And that way we are reacting to what the range slider is currently having as a value. We're using that as input for specific parts of the UI. The other thing we're also doing is picking specific colors based on this number as well. So this is always an array of 3 different colors. And these colors are, whenever the feeling changed within a use effect, we're setting them as custom CSS properties or CSS variables. So we're picking these colors and setting them in the DOM on top of our wrapper element, because we're using a ref right here. So if we quickly inspect that, then you see that if we take a look at our wrapper div, that there is an inline style setting these 3 colors. And as soon as we change the slider, you see that the colors update. So then for this knob, we're actually using one of these color variables, in this case color B, to set the color of this knob. And that's why that part is already dynamic. But of course, that's not a gradient, and we were here to animate gradients. So let's go ahead and change that gray background into a gradient as well, so we can start animating that. And we do that by removing the background slate from the wrapper, and then we're gonna add a background gradient to bottom right. So that gives us a gradient that goes from top left to bottom right. But by default, of course, that doesn't have any colors. So for that, we also need to add a few more class names. The first one will be a from class name, which tells Tailwind what the starting color of the gradient will be. And in our case, we're going to use the square brackets, so we can add - color A in here. So we have a gradient of color A that is the starting point. And then we're going to add a to class name as well, which goes to color C, which is the last color stop. And then there will also be a color in between, which we can use the via class name for. And that should of course be color B, and we shouldn't forget the 2 dashes at the beginning. And then you already see that we have added the gradient in here. And if we switch, then the colors change. However, there is no animation yet. And you might say we can simply add a transition, for example, colors. Because what colors does is it adds a transition to color and background color. Yeah, it doesn't do background image. So we can, for example, use square brackets and then say background. So that way we add a transition on all background properties. However, it's still not animating. And that is because we cannot animate gradients in CSS. It's simply not possible. At least, you'll see in this video it is, but by default it's not possible. So we're gonna need to do something a little bit different here. And what we need to do different is, instead of animating the background, we actually want to animate the properties, so the custom CSS variables. And to do that, we want to change the value of transition property. It shouldn't be background, it should be the name of the CSS variable. So if you would simply add colors A in here, you see that Tailwind converts this into transition property var A, so it would take the value of it instead of the actual variable. So unfortunately, that's not gonna work right now in Tailwind, so we need to do things a little bit different. We need to use the square brackets to start with, because then we can write our own CSS in Tailwind that says transition property : color A. And that will still generate exactly the same. However, if we add an underscore here, which is the same as a space in Tailwind, then it will really render the name of that variable. And from that point on, we can also add, again, we need a space, color B, as well as color C. So now you see that it adds all three of these variables as a property that it can transition. However, because we're now only specifying transition property, we also need to add our own duration and easing. So we can still add ease in as well as a duration 500. So we have the transition property, but also the easing and the duration, so everything animates. However, I just hit save, so everything moved to the end here. It still won't work. And that is again because your browser doesn't know how to animate CSS variables. And there is the new thing that comes in here. And that new thing is called add property. And that helps you define almost the types of a specific CSS variable. So if we quickly look at the MDN docs, then we see what this looks like. It's a definition that says add property, where you add the name of your property, and then tell it what type of syntax it is, in this case a color, if it inherits from its parent or not, and an initial value. And for syntax specifically, this could be a color, but it can also be a length, number, percentage, color, image, URL. It can be a lot, and you're almost defining a type of your CSS variable here. And what this does is it helps your browser to understand what type of thing this is. So that way, if you're animating a CSS variable and it is a color, it knows that if you want to go from red to green, how to animate between one and the other state. And this is the missing link that we were needing to be able to animate CSS variables. So we're gonna add this, and from that moment on, you will see that we're able to animate these variables and thus animate the gradients. So if we quickly go back to the property, you see that this is a basic CSS definition. So we can't add this right here in Tailwind, we need to add that to our CSS file. And if in Tailwind you want to include some CSS that you want to add to all of your pages and every place instead of being a utility that's only in your CSS file if it's used, you can use the add layer base. And in here you can define whatever CSS you want, and that will always be bundled within your CSS. So let's define add property and then color A, where we can then say syntax is color and inherits is true, because if it's defined higher up in a parent, it should still use that value. And for the initial value, we just define transparent, which is the default value of a color. And that initial value that's needed by the CSS definition, it simply needs to have this value. Otherwise, it will not register this add property and it will just ignore it. So you have to specify a value, even though it's not used in our transition, because we are setting the variable itself. But the spec says if you don't set this initial value, in most of the cases, it will be skipped and won't be used. So let's add the property for B and C as well. And right now, we've written some types for our CSS custom properties. And we are telling the browser that all of these three variables are of type or syntax color. And this is then something that it can use to animate. So if we now go back to our CSS gradient, and then I'm gonna drag the slider, you see that the colors already change. There's nothing we have to do to make this work. And the reason that it's animating is, again, because we have added the transition property of all of these three variables. And added a duration and an easing, of course, but that makes this animate like any other property. That's so cool, right? And if you want to know how to animate your gradients, this is it. This is the only thing you need to know. So, could be the end of the video, but not for me. I still want to add those blobs that are animated in the background as well, but they're gradients that simply use one color. They don't really animate within a gradient anymore. But still, I think it looks way nicer if we would still add them. So definitely stick around if you're still interested in that. So let's add them. Because we already have quite a long line of CSS properties, or class names, of course, I'm right now gonna enable line wrapping, which moves everything to new line when it goes out of my window. So that way it's a little bit easier for you to follow along. Because what we need to do is, if we quickly take a look at the example, there's two blobs that are kind of moving around here. So what I want to do is I want to use two pseudo elements before and then after to create these two blobs and animate them. So let's go back. These pseudo elements we're going to use before and then after, of course. That needs to be positioned absolute. And let me look to my left to get the right positioning, because for the before one, I've added a left of 20% and also before top of 10%. And then we're gonna add a height of 50% and a width of 70%. And we're also gonna set a transform origin of 60%, and that origin is simply helpful to give a kind of randomness in the animation, because in a minute we're gonna rotate it, and by setting kind of a random origin, the rotation will look a little bit more natural, I think, because it's not always exactly in the center, it's a little bit offset, and that's why I see like more of an oval animation shape. But yeah, it's just, for all of these settings, I've really been playing around a little bit to see where the element would end up and then just go from there and try to make it nice. Because I can quickly add, for example, before background of red 300, because then you can already see where we are actually positioning this element. because I also still want to add a before rounded 3 extra large, so it has some rounded edges. And what I also want to do is I want to blur this thing. Blur with, for example, 50 pixels. So you see that the blurriness already gets there. And I also want to turn up the brightness a little bit by making it 125%. So that way we can in a minute use the exact same colors that we're using in the variables, but because we're making them a little bit more bright, they will look a little bit different, even though they are exactly the same color. So, and I think it's actually already time to add in the specific colors in here instead of using the red. So let's change this into background gradient to bottom right. And then we're gonna add the from and to color. I'm not gonna do the stop in the middle because I only wanna use 2 colors in these blobs. So we're gonna add before from color A. And we're also gonna add before to minus color B. So that way you already see this light blob that's right in the center, in the top center of the card. And now the only thing that still needs to happen is that this thing also starts to move around a little bit organically. So what I already did is I went ahead and in my Tailwind config, I created a small keyframe that's actually moving specific things around and rotating and scaling a little bit. And you can see that right here. It's setting a rotate that's 0 in the beginning, then it rotates 40%, then or 40 degrees. Then it goes to transform, it adds a scale, makes things larger, bigger, translates to a specific place. I really put in some random numbers here because I don't know what I'm doing. I just want to have it look nice. Because I already see I added a rotate of 90% here. Well, that works, but of course that's really odd if you have 40% here and 90% here. So this is not something I would use in production because this is really, messy, I think. But it works, it just adds some randomness. And what I can do, because I defined this animation blob here as well, that takes in the blob keyframes, is I can simply go back to my before element and say before animate blob. And if I do that, you see that the blob starts to move around. And it's kind of rotating and scaling, it's doing everything, and it feels a little bit organic. So when making this, I thought, okay, this looks nice, let's stop here. So that's what I did, and that's the animation we have to work with right now. But we can also still copy all of these styles actually, and also add an after in there. So let's do that, and then I'm gonna select all of these befores with Command D. And then we're gonna make this an after. And of course I need to change the position, which is a left of 40, a top of 30, a height of 80%, the width is the same, and the origin is also the same. And the only thing I did change though is that instead of a animate blob, I also created an animate blob reverse, which actually runs the exact same animation, but in reverse. So we have some sort of more randomness to this. And then you already see that there's now 2 blobs moving around. And as soon as we now change this slider, you see that they take on the new colors. And they also animate because the whole property is animated. These colors, they're just changing over time, and that's what also the pseudo elements are looking at. So that looks super nice in my opinion. And this way we finally have a way to animate gradients. So to recap it once more, what we're doing is we are setting these inline variables, custom CSS properties with colors. And then we're using them as a from, via, and to color for the gradients. So they're just set as normal colors. And then we're just adding a transition property to the specific variables instead of color or background in general, or width or height. You can of course transition anything, but now we're transitioning the specific custom properties. And then the final piece that actually enables everything is defining these add property rules. they tell the browser what type your variable actually is. And by telling it it's a color, it now knows how to transition from one color to another. And then it doesn't matter if you use this color in a variable or as a background, it will simply transition the property, and then that property will be displayed, even if it's in a gradient. And that then suddenly enables the animation of gradients, which is just super, super nice. One thing I did tell in the beginning though, but might be good to repeat again, is that the current browser support is really good, but it's unfortunately not working in Firefox. So you see that the blobs are working because that's simply moving the pseudo element around. But if I change the slider, you see that the color just switches over instead of animates from one to another. But I think this is still okay. You could really still decide that this is what you're going for, because Firefox users then have a little bit of less experience, but others have a super, super nice experience. And hopefully, if everyone starts using this more and more, it also forces Firefox to release these updates quicker and hopefully bring it out to everyone as soon as possible. And that brings us to the end of today's video. It was a rather short one because I really need to get to party right now. I first need to edit this video too. But I really hope you still enjoyed this video as well and that you learned something about how to animate gradients and this new add property syntax. Because there's so many nice CSS features coming our way right now that I think learning about these small things is also super useful because it makes you a better front-ender in general. So absolutely dive into this and try to experiment with it yourself to see where you might be able to use this even more. Or just go ahead and tell your designer that you can animate gradients right now and let them come up with something really cool and implement it still today. So that was it. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, definitely leave a like. Please subscribe as well. And I hope to see you in the next video.